Hi, I'm Don Frazier, and we're continuing our series on the Civil War in Louisiana and Texas. So, the last thing we talked about was the federal attempts to exploit and expand their conquest of Louisiana and the lower Mississippi after capturing the city of New Orleans in late April, early May. What they had done is occupy Baton Rouge, left the garrison in New Orleans, occupied Baton Rouge, and moved up to Vicksburg in an attempt to force the garrison there out by shelling them with naval gunfire. While all of that activity is the focus of federal intentions, they had also thrown a regiment into the LaFourche country in the sugar parishes to essentially project Union power in that region, but they only had a small army to begin with, and they could only allocate just the 21st Indiana to carry out that chore. Well, the Hoosiers did their best, but finally they're relieved by the 8th Vermont. And the Indiana troops head back to New Orleans. 8th Vermont takes over, and it's the 8th Vermont that has to keep that territory in Union control. Well, it's too much territory and too few troops. Meanwhile, the Confederates begin to recover. Louisiana state officials had to move the capital of the state, or capital of Confederate Louisiana, to the city of Opelousas. And there, Governor Moore begins to try to assemble some sort of army. Each of the parishes had militias. The question was, would the militia turn out? Now, if they would turn out, where would they turn out to? So Moore immediately starts organizing camps of instruction. Camp Pratt near New Iberia, there's a camp near Opelousas, and then there's also a camp in Monroe up in northeastern Louisiana. And the idea is to muster the militia, gather them to these points, and there to form new regiments, essentially an army from scratch to protect western Louisiana. At the same time, he has a bona fide Confederate regiment, or at least the makings of one, that is starting to coalesce at Camp Pratt. That's Valcine Fournet's 11th Louisiana Infantry Battalion, the Yellow Jackets. So Moore is doing his best. He writes to President Jefferson Davis and says, hey, here's what's going on. I have about 2,000 men starting to pour in, and I would like to form them into regiments. Meanwhile, I'm going to send Fournet into the sugar parishes, the Union-occupied region from Brashear City all the way to Donaldsonville, up and down Bayou LaFourche, and over to Bayous des Allemands, and into the suburbs of New Orleans, and see what we can scrape out of there. So we're talking about Assumption Parish, Ascension Parish, St. James Parish, those sorts of places, maybe as far as St. Charles Parish, and certainly the parishes on up from there to St. Mary's Parish. He gets a startling response back from the Confederate government. And that response is, we do not form new regiments out of men that are subject to the Confederate Conscription Act. Now, the Confederate Conscription Act, you're going to hear a lot about that, passes in April of 1862. It says if you're between the ages of 18 and 35, you must serve in the Confederate Army. You really don't have much of a choice. So with Fournet's regiment, these are guys that are pouring in just after that law passes so that they are not conscripted. The difference is the militia are still staying at home. And so what Jefferson Davis says is you take those men and you send them to Louisiana regiments elsewhere to bring them up to strength. So Moore is just beside himself. He says, all right, I don't even have enough troops here to handle the chores in my home state, and you're telling me to take manpower out of Louisiana and ship it as far away as Virginia and Tennessee so that those regiments can be brought up to strength. Meanwhile, western Louisiana is completely without manpower. To further aggravate the governor, Louisiana had been grouped into a new Department of the Trans-Mississippi. The commander of this new region, this new military zone, was Thomas Hindman. Now, Hindman's headquarters was in Little Rock. And first thing he looked around, he says, I need lots and lots of supplies. So he sent regiments out to gather in all the supplies wherever they might exist. And that included all the way to Alexandria, Louisiana. Governor Moore had very carefully scraped together whatever state resources he could and piled them all there at Alexandria. He turned around one day and they were all being shipped to Little Rock. The problem is, all of this material had essentially been bought and paid for by Louisiana taxpayers. So he writes a letter to Jefferson Davis one more time saying, look, the Confederate government hasn't given me a single musket. And now all this stuff that the people of Louisiana have accumulated have been hauled off for service elsewhere. Says that's not right, it's not fair, and it won't stand. In addition, Western Louisiana and Texas had all been lumped into one sort of district within this larger department. Well, the new commander, Paul O. Hebert, decided to put his headquarters not in Louisiana, but in Houston, Texas. So Moore quickly figured out that he was smack dab in the middle of no man's land between one headquarters in Little Rock and another headquarters in Houston, and Richmond is so concerned about the growing threat to the nation's capital, the Confederate capital at Richmond, that they're not really paying attention. So Moore is trying to figure out how to make bricks without straw in West Louisiana. So the first thing he says is, well, let's see what I can draw out of the militias within the sugar parishes. And so he sends Fournet's guys on a foray into the sugar parishes. Crosses over Berwick Bay, which is about a 600-yard expanse of the, it's actually an outlet, an estuary of the Shaflaya River as it heads towards the Gulf, about 600 yards wide. So they cross over that into Brashear City. They capture a few Federals that are there trying to organize that post and make the railroad run on time. Then he goes down the railroad tracks all the way to Bayous des Allemands, burns the bridge there, declares victory, and tells everybody, hey, look at us, aren't we swell? The Confederates have arrived now. Rise up and follow me. And the militia in the sugar parishes says, not so fast. There's not a lot of you guys. And we've been watching Federal gunboats go up and down the Mississippi. We've got a lot of cannons. And we've also seen the 21st Indiana go marching up and down this road, and now the 8th Vermont. Those guys look well put together, well equipped, and well supported with victuals. So tell us what the Confederacy is going to do for us. And Fournet says, well, you should be patriots and join this new nation. And they said, well, we'll be happy to join as long as you can tell us that you'll stay here. And Fournet said, well, I'm not staying here. It's a death trap. So, of course, all of the militia says, then I think we'll sit it out. And another thing that we would like for you to do is not cause a whole lot of trouble. Because what you're going to do is irritate the enemy and then leave, and we'll be left to pay the consequences. Well, Fournet's movements around the Lafourche country, they burned the bridge at des Allemands. Another foray, they burned the bridge near Thibodaux over the Lafourche. And it causes the Federals to kind of get a little nervous about what was going on there. So they fall all the way back to the suburbs of New Orleans and begin to get a little anxious. One of the things that had happened while the Federals had occupied this region is slaves had left plantations and had all flocked to the Union camps. Well, they didn't know what to do with them, so they'd been using the railroad to ship them to New Orleans. Well, there was no official status over what to do with these self-liberated slaves. And so the commander in New Orleans shipped them all back to the plantations by the same trains that they'd come in on. So now the 8th Vermont has to escort self-emancipated slaves back into a region where they will probably be re-enslaved. In the middle of this chore, the Confederates ambush train and kill about a half dozen Federal troops. So now the Federals are going, we don't need that region right now because we can't hold it. We can't feed the slaves that are all flocking to our camps. We're going to draw our lines back in and kind of hold the line. So now the LaForce country is not federal, neither is it Confederate. And the militia says, then what we're going to do is we're going to stay at home and have a sandwich, and you guys are just going to have to figure out who's going to occupy this region, and then we'll know what our new reality is. They did not trust the Confederacy. Now remember from an earlier conversation, this region was a little lukewarm towards secession anyway. So now this is how they're going to vote. We're just going to sit it out and see what happens. When Confederate conscription officers start going door to door, a bunch of the military-aged men just head back into the marae, head back into the swamps, and say, you want us? Come get us. But you better bring a bunch of your pals, because we will resist. Well, 4A comes out. 4A comes out and tells Moore, look, I can't do anything with these guys. And in fact, they had threatened to arrest me if I didn't leave the region, because all I was doing was stirring up the Union occupiers. So Moore says, fine, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send some partisan ranger companies into that same region, and we'll keep an eye on the Federals, and we'll try to talk sense into all these militia units and get them to turn out. Well, problem with these partisan ranger units, these are mounted men that are exempted from conscription, allowed to choose their form and terms of service. They're listed for a number of years, but they get to essentially serve on their own conditions. And so most of them are mounted units, really without a lot of the trappings of the formal Confederate military structure, and they come close to being guerrillas in their actual application. So what Moore has is a couple of companies of these guys, and these all are guys from up in northern Louisiana. They do not parler français. They're anglophones. They're not francophones. And they're heading into a very francophone part of Louisiana. To understand Louisiana, let me put it to you this way. It's really broken into two regions, and it's divided right there at Alexandria. A buddy of mine from Thibodaux says it's easy to understand. North of Alexandria, that's where they butter their rice. And from Alex south, that's all dirty rice country. Well, we got some buttered rice guys coming into dirty rice country in order to try to convince the people of the LaForce region that the Confederacy is real. Well, there's immediately a cultural conflict, and the southern Louisianans do not trust the northern Louisianans. In addition, these partisan rangers tend to like to ride up and down the levee along the Mississippi and occasionally shoot at transports and warships. The locals in the various towns along the river say, would you quit doing that, because this is not going to end well? And the commander, Major McWaters, says, I'll take it under consideration. Again, he won't have to live with the consequences as much as the locals will. And in fact, it's going to yield very bitter fruit in the coming days. So, against long odds, Moore has at least made an attempt to project the reality of a Confederate nation onto this part of Louisiana, but it's not very convincing. So what he does is he writes back to Richmond and says, look, what I need more than anything, if I can get some Confederate regiments shipped back here. So in these armies that are already shot up and they need manpower, I need you to release some Louisiana regiments and send them home. And on top of that, I need you to send me a general. I need a good general that will organize the operations west of the Mississippi on behalf of the Confederate government. Send me a general, send me some troops, do something to help me. Right now, up to this point, the Confederate government has done only things that have reversed any sort of attempts I've been making. So quit being unuseful and start doing something to help the Confederate cause in West Louisiana. What we'll learn in the future is how the Confederacy responds.